There's something so unsettling about a war that begins without a battlefield. There's no drums, there's no grand declaration. There's just a disagreement over where one place ends and another begins. In the early 1800s, that kind of quiet tension would not seem really all that unusual. But in the 1730s, along the border of Pennsylvania and Maryland, it grew into something far more dangerous. And on May 25th of 1738, what had started as a disagreement on paper had already turned into violence, arrests, and fear, forcing a treaty that would finally bring a fragile pause to a conflict that never should have escalated that far in the first place. At the center of it all was a simple question that refused to stay simple. Where exactly was the boundary between Pennsylvania and Maryland? Both colonies, remember this is back in the colonial days, both colonies had charters. Both of them believed they were correct, and both could point to language that supported their claim. The problem was that those charters did not align with reality. Geography had been misunderstood when they were made, and measurements had been off, and what looked precise on plain parchment became uncertain when translated onto land. That uncertainty created a strip of territory wide enough to matter and valuable enough to fight over. For any of my friends out there that like to crochet like I do, it's like trying to follow AI directions on how to crochet a sweater. It just doesn't translate. It doesn't work. So into that space came settlers, families looking for land, farmers that were clearing fields, people who didn't care much which colony they belonged to, just so long as they could build something for themselves and find something stable. But stability was one of the things that they did not get. One authority would arrive and tell them that they owed taxes. Another would follow up and say that the land belonged somewhere else, so they owed taxes somewhere else. Titles were issued, then challenged, then reissued. In some cases, people paid twice just to avoid losing everything that they had already built. It wasn't just confusing, this was exhausting. Then came the men who turned the confusion into confrontation. Among them was Thomas Crisap. He was a Maryland loyalist who did not simply claim land, he enforced those claims. He sold property to settlers who had already been living there under Pennsylvania authority. He collected rents. He refused to recognize Pennsylvania officials. And when attempts were made to arrest this guy, he resisted, and sometimes violently. There are accounts of doors being broken down, of gunfire being exchanged, of men being dragged away. And what had been a legal dispute was now something much closer to a frontier conflict on the East Coast. The surprising part is not that violence occurred, of course. It's who carried it out. This was not a war fought by distant armies under unclear commands. This wasn't the Wild West. This was carried out by ordinary people. Farmers, laborers, neighbors, militia units did arrive eventually, but not for a while. But long before that, the conflict had already taken root at the local level. Homes were raided. Livestock was taken and stolen. Land was seized. At times, entire groups of settlers were forced off their property they had built with their own hands. The line between law enforcement and retaliation blurred until it was almost impossible to tell which one was which. As tensions escalated, both colonies began to send more organized forces into the region. Maryland militia entered the disputed territory, asserting authority and attempting to reinforce their own claims. Pennsylvania, of course, responded in kind. Arrests were made, sometimes undone by force. One particularly dramatic moment involved Cresap himself being captured, restrained, and taken to Philadelphia. Even then, he reportedly maintained his defense, insisting that he was still within Maryland. That kind of stubborn certainty was not unique to this man, though. It was shared on both sides. By this point, the situation had grown too unstable to ignore. Complaints reached higher authorities, and eventually the matter was brought before King George himself, King George II. His intervention was not, of course, an immediate resolution, but it was a turning point. In August of 1737, he ordered that both of the colonies to cease hostilities. That order did slow the violence, but it didn't end the dispute. Negotiations followed, and finally on May 25th of 1738, a treaty was signed. Pioneers and prisoners were exchanged. A temporary boundary was established. Both sides agreed, at least on paper, to respect that line until a final decision could eventually be made. Even then, the story wasn't really all the way over. The final boundary would not be permanently settled until decades later, when surveyors Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon, pay attention to those names, would draw the line that still carries their names today. By then, the violence had faded, but its effects had lingered. Families had been, of course, displaced and trust had been broken. And all of it had started with a disagreement that might have seemed minor at first glance. What makes this moment in history so striking is how familiar it feels. Not the specifics, but the pattern. A simple misunderstanding becomes a disagreement, and a disagreement becomes a conflict. And a conflict, if left unchecked and people don't talk about these things, can grow into something that affects people far removed from the original issue. The settlers along that disputed border that eventually became the Mason-Dixon line, they didn't start the argument, but they had to live with the consequences for their entire generation. So here's the question I want to leave you to think about and to answer in the comments, because you know how much I love your comments. At what point does an agreement stop being about being right and start becoming about refusing to take a step back and sit your butt down? And of course, if you enjoy random, bizarre historical stories like this, make sure you follow the History Happens Facebook page for more deep dives into history's most fascinating moments, and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, because every subscriber helps, and you know how I love you guys. Thank you for watching.